Okay, thank you so much. I personally also, as an audience member, really enjoyed the presentations. Being kind of an outsider, I think I'll shift the theme of the discussion a little bit and go into more of a general side. We looked at observations, predictions, and then decision-making in environmental systems. So a general question for all the panelists would be, can you share a moment where you made an assumption about AI's role in environmental systems, and then you had to revise this role during your work? And how has your approach changed from then on? And if anyone wants to go.
Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, so this assumption was perhaps more to do with the collaboration that we had back in 2019. So I think from the AI community side, it seemed like, we've already sorted out climate projections out into the future, that we have fairly good information at a very granular household scale, that we can make predictions and make it kind of visualized to the broader audience, who could be, just people typing in their address in Google Street View and seeing how their houses might look like. But something that we learned during this project, or a piece of communication which was missing very much from the climate community, was we haven't actually, there's a lot of uncertainty in climate models, projections still, that you can't say that your house will get flooded specifically in the year 2050 or so. But this wasn't very well understood by the AI community.
Okay, thank you so much. And how do you think after this point you've made conscious decisions in your future projects and work to kind of take that into consideration as you go ahead?
Yeah, so this was back in 2019. After this, we could see the emulators and sort of speed up of AI models having an impact. Me as a climate scientist, initially I thought, well, that is the real problem to solve to begin with. But I think from the AI community side at that point, it seemed like, well, we need to change the minds of people around climate change, which is totally important. But it was less understood that there were still gaps in climate literature itself to resolve this. So, yeah, one thing is there was a technological advancement where you could make high-resolution forecasts, but you still can't predict exactly if your house will get flooded in the year 2050. We reduce with neural GCM and others the range of uncertainty, but it's still not super precise.
Okay, thank you so much. Anyone else would like to?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally what we always get very excited about new data sets or new tools being around, and so obviously we sort of learned it the hard way with our own deep learning model that we developed. Now Google Earth Alpha is around, so we could have shortcutted it substantially. But still, when we present this to policymakers and say, well, we actually think there is a good way we can help you measure A or B, or in our case, forest biomass, then we are pitched in competition with traditional models of data gathering. So it's more kind of the policy environment that sort of pushes us back to, well, we have to justify if we are in line with the official standard approach that is actually taking one sample of maybe questionable, well, let's not question it. Let's just say it's one sample that speaks for a large geography, like the size of a canton, or in India, the size of a district. So in our, I guess our case, more in response to your question, is more that of being ambitious in terms of using data sets and tools that are now made available, but there's this strong lag with the policy community that does not want to have its status quo of data collection and its understanding of what is the truth being challenged by some AI geeks that are coming around and trying to explain the world differently.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think just building on that point, I think one of the main assumptions is kind of this idea that higher resolution data or information or decision strategies are going to be useful and or used, and that is very much kind of situated in like long histories of the ways in which environmental decisions are made across scales, both by governments, but also by individual landowners. And that just having this information doesn't necessarily mean that it is like what a decision maker like wants to use or what they will use. So I think having like a long-term like participatory process in the development of these models and of their downstream uses is really critical for ensuring that they're actually actionable and that the information that is communicated is useful.
Thank you.
Just to add briefly to that from my current world, you might have the most accurate high-resolution model available, but if the markets don't respond to that particular model, then actually the trading workflows and the trading companies don't care about it as such. So the economic value is kind of non-obvious of this. Obviously, if you were to create very high-resolution forecast over time and there was certain players who had access to this, then there's going to be an unfair advantage related to this information. But otherwise, just building on what you were saying, it's not obvious the exact need.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because in general, money talks. So you're making decisions based on where the economic kind of incentive is sometimes. But I think this was already touched in some of your answers, but let's talk about how in general, now that model capabilities are increasing, we're moving more towards a deep learning side. How do you distinguish between this data unevenness, whether it's just missing measurement or it's really gaps caused by socio-economic or political realities that people are on the ground are facing? Anyone like to go? Or I can put you guys on the spot. Maybe Millie?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? Like, I think that was kind of one of the last points in my talk, is that like actually disentangling those two things is a really hard problem, particularly when you don't necessarily have ground truth information, like in a lot of environmental contexts, like in the context of biodiversity distribution modeling. Like, how do you actually disentangle what is an observational process from what is a true ecological process is a really hard problem. And I mean, yeah, I don't have an answer.
Sure. Then maybe I would also like for Michael to add his insights, and then I think I'm assuming, but you could tell me wrong, but Karthik might have a different perspective on this based on, some of the self-supervised methods that we're moving into. So if you'd like to.
I think really less on the methodological part, but more reiterating, I guess, my key point about context. And I think sort of this is more remote sensing than it is AI, but a good remote sensing project will always strike an even balance between an understanding of the signal and an understanding of the object, whatever it is. So of course now we're talking environment. So it's always our endeavor would always be to work with somebody who understands that particular geography, because we've also worked in contexts, and that was more for media that had requests where there was just no ground data available. So we worked in Western China, in the Uyghurs, where the Uyghurs live and where there's obviously it's a political difficult environment, and we had to work almost blind. But then we kind of had to navigate our way through to people who can understand, who can give us context. So that it doesn't respond squarely to your questions on models, but more putting the balance between, or reiterating my point, that a signal understanding is as relevant as the contextual understanding. And that, I think, is the best way to navigate, regardless whether it's a traditional signal understanding of remote sensing or whether it's an advanced application of a deep learning model that will obviously amplify the relevance of the signal because you can do so many more things with it.
Thank you so much.
So relating self-supervised learning with observations, it really depends on the modality as well, right? So we haven't made as much progress in other modalities like vision and video and so forth, right? Compared to language, I would say. So the reliability of a generalized foundation model around this domain versus in other domains, that varies. So I don't think you always still want to correct it with ground truth. You do want to get that human feedback loop happening, regardless of the modality. So I guess if it's, in the case of vision, right, it's very hard to make valid claims specifically about a certain region where there wasn't an exact kind of observation that was made and there was no like human ground truth ever present there. Whereas in language, it's also perhaps a bit easier to have that reinforcement learning type human feedback mechanism as well. Curious to know what others think.
Okay, thank you so much. I think, yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I think both Millie and Karthik have experimented with RL systems, and specifically for environmental applications. Maybe we can also look a little bit on something that was touched during the talks about the changing landscape of policy, both in the EU and I guess globally as well, where we're having global biodiversity frameworks, so the EU 2030 targets. How do you balance stakeholder alignment with these changes during, let's say, for example, audits that Michael does or environmental decisions you'd make moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I can start, but this is sort of more broadly falls Millie in your remit. But I guess I do have some observations more in terms of the commercial use case of geospatial data and AI. Probably not a too optimistic one, because I think on the commercial side, that thirst for knowledge that then would spur action was somehow linked to regulation and disclosure requirements, sometimes maybe also to reputational elements. I'm talking about sort of the private sector, and sometimes in getting an additional information edge that will then, I mean, I guess in the trading community, right, if you have alternative data and it sort of gets you ahead of the curve, then you can monetize it. And there we see a shifting environment on the regulatory end, with sort of many of these environmental regulations being how you call that, sort of being put at the back burner with regards to other priorities. So that's making a bit of a challenging policy environment, so a challenging environment on the commercial side of things. I think on the public public policy side of things, and that obviously that's more Millie to comment on it, but there the awareness is unbroken. I guess one part maybe where I would be a bit concerned is more what does that mean for open source data, because in our community we rely a lot on open source data, and that's more an area where I think the trend is not so clear. There we probably have seen sort of a bit of a golden age in some areas on open source data, with much of open source data becoming available, but I'm not sure if that will persist in also with regards to AI models and a need to sort of have that more done in a controlled environment. That's a bit of a different discussion. But yeah, open source data is probably an important point on environmental policy as well. But I'm digressing, and more Millie on I think was more on environmental policy and the realm of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of dimensions to it. I mean, like there is this constant question of like changing and shifting and evolving regulatory landscapes, and how we create our science to inform those like quickly evolving political processes, when like the scientific process doesn't necessarily like happen at the same like temporal like speed as regulatory changes, which is something I've run into a lot in my work of like devising strategies to help inform policies when the policies are changing more quickly than your papers are being published. It can be like quite an interesting space to work in. But then I think that there's the other side of it, which is that like these changing political landscapes like shift our actual landscapes. So trying to understand the ways in which policies are like giving us insight into our ecosystems, and like into like how which policies are most effective for like facilitating durable conservation or effective climate mitigation and things like this.
That's super interesting. Would you have an example for us where, yeah, like you were focused on one part of a specific policy and that really changed the decisions that you were making? Maybe just an example of where this was the case.
Like a quickly evolving policy example. Yeah, so I was recently working a lot, and I just showed like one figure of it on the nature restoration regulation in the EU, which was like something that was an incredibly controversial policy, largely because of agricultural lobbies and otherwise that like we're questioning the feasibility of these policies and their potential societal impacts. And so when there's a lot of back and forth on policies, there's often like, will the policy pass? Will it not pass? What will the final version of the policy look like when it's something that's being like contested and that's being like, kind of drafted in real time. And so when you're trying to assess the feasibility of a policy or the potential impacts of a policy, and that policy is an ever-changing target, there's I think quite an interesting role of the scientist or of kind of the data scientist in that process.
So I guess two themes to touch on here. One is open source, the other one regulation, right? So if we were to speak about regulation, the world that I'm in, it's highly regulated, right? So I think we have, I forget this number, I used to have it on my slide, I don't know, 170 or in that 300 to 170 range. It's a long range, I can't remember the exact number, but a lot of regulators. And this is way more than the number of regulators who are on the backs of tech companies and big tech and so forth. I myself, within the firm, right, like even if I have a PhD, adjunct prof or whatever, I'm not allowed to trade myself because you need to go through a trading license, all of this. You need to run every single sort of trade through like our chief risk and compliance officer as well. So there's a whole regulatory process that's involved. So it's a bit interesting in the AI space in that it's like super unregulated and that anyone can go and build up anything coming out of Hugging Face and just launch models, and this manifests in real impacts in the world. On the open source side, I mean, long term, it's like an ecosystem level win because more people get involved, like the technology advances as such from open source. But there's different private companies and other entities, right? And depending on the sector that you're in, sometimes the open source releases might not be quite there yet as well, which could impact the community depending on who the end stakeholder is in a different way, right? So that's something to also look into.
Thank you so much. I'm getting like a timer from the team already. Maybe a quick wrap-up question would be, we said that energy demands are set to increase, production demands are set to increase. What would be the next sequence step that we need to pay attention to before acting on AI-driven insights for the general audience or for everybody? What's something that they should kind of keep in mind in the next stages?
Should we go around? I think trust will be important. We've seen or we've been asked about cases where satellite data has been manipulated, or there was some fear that satellite data was being manipulated, and of course now image generation, deepfakes, etc. So I think as researchers or practitioners or you scientists generating these insights, we need to make sure that that we still keep the trust of policymakers. Who have their own interests in forming policy with the data sets that we deliver. And on the very practical example, without sort of being too outspoken, because I think you live stream or record, but in our case, in that one particular Indian state that I mentioned earlier on, of course, the data, our data products, were also of interest for both the policymakers and the conservation community to make their argument, because the conservation community wanted to make their argument that too much industrial development is not desired, and here so much ecosystem is being lost. And the policymaker community also wanted to use the data to say, well, look, it's actually maybe not so bad, and we have to balance it because here is development. And if that one if these these different interests, or there's always different interest in sort of the type of data products that we deliver. We need to make sure that also there are always mechanisms available to check the data sets we deliver, so that there is trust in the data sets that we deliver, so that they're not being manipulated. And I think that manipulation in AI, of course, is already in everybody's concern, but also in the remote sensing community, that's something that we need to be concerned with.
Yeah, I echo the sentiment around, so I would call it safety guardrails on these models, especially as, I mean, it's fine, like if end user is in a B2C market and people are playing around with ChatGPT, but when it comes to deployment within the enterprise space, we won't let a chatbot go live and start trading. It's just not going to happen until all the safety guardrails, everything is in place, especially at the frequencies that we kind of trade at. But I do want to make a plug and say, I think the energy plus AI intersection is getting super interesting at this point in time. You see tech companies sourcing their own sets, source of energy, but then you have energy commodity players who, they're experts at doing this as well, and how they interface with the tech companies. That's an interesting space, alongside just improving the efficiency purely of the AI models themselves to scale it down to be more compact, other kinds of neuromorphic type architecture, some of those which might be coming on board. So that energy reduction or energy increase, that's an interesting space to explore.
Yeah, and I think, I guess I will reiterate the point about trustworthiness and ensuring that models are trustworthy to a variety of users, that trust can mean very different things to a policymaker than they mean to an individual landowner. And so thinking about that when we're developing our models and just thinking about their downstream uses. And then I think as a subpoint to that is thinking about the fairness of these models and the ways in which they risk potentially propagating inequities that exist in society as it stands, and how we can ensure that these are models that are enhancing environmental justice and kind of supporting society as a whole and not subpopulations of society.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think we'll wrap up the panel discussion part. I personally wanted to extend it a little bit more. I think we're kind of digging into the surface level of all of these interesting and complex topics, but there's a lot more to discover. Of course, the speakers will be around, and I think during lunch you can mingle, but we might go to questions now. In the audience, does anyone have any questions back there? Could we get a mic to the audience member over there, please?
Thanks for the talk. My question is to Mukkavilli. So I think we're being a lot on this aspect that AI should be first and foremost equitable and responsible. And I think within this space, we are, in my opinion at least, we are sort of at this level. But I would say looking at more on the industry side in the last few years, it's first build things and less on the responsible AI side. And how can, so my question there is how can we ensure that this space sort of remains this way where we first care about the impacts and sort of having this future rather than relying on technology to sort of save the world for us?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. I think it really comes down to us as users and as participants in environmental decision-making processes, right? There's always the capacity to refuse technology and to refuse data products that we don't feel meet some standard of fairness or of trustworthiness. And of course, that's easier said than done. And ultimately, ideally, that is something that's regulated by governments and not falling on individuals. But yeah, so that's kind of a cop-out answer, but I think it's more so a good question than it is something I have an answer to.
Thank you so much. I think we'd have to unfortunately wrap up and move on to lunch, but I just want to thank all of the speakers. It was really interesting and insightful discussion. We looked at AI systems at different levels of governance, at different levels of complexity, and thank you so much. I would like everyone to give the speakers a warm hand, please.